I am worried that there are doctors out there who do not know that there are legal and professional requirements, which include filling in documents that you then give to your patients when you are prescribing Schedule A drugs like opioids or benzos. And the reason why I think that is the case is because I was actually one of them. Now, AHPRA is clearly cracking down on doctors who are not familiar with the medicines prescribing code for Schedule A drugs. And I have demonstrated this in the video How to Use Script Check, where I have described that 30 doctors have been reported for not checking Script Check prior to issuing a prescription of Schedule A drugs. And those doctors were fined up to $19,000. Now, the thing to point out here, if you think that by mentioning to your patients that these drugs are addictive, that we should at some point wean you off these drugs every time you do a prescription for that patient, and you've been doing so for the last few years, if you feel that that is an acceptable standard of care, then unfortunately you are wrong, and AHPRA is going to get you. I'm going to talk through the rules here, and I'm going to go through the prescription code for Schedule A drugs. And if you want a summarized version of the very long document that I'm going to show you, I have created a 3 to 4 page PDF that I'm happy to share with anyone, and just feel free to click on the link in the description below. Now, finally, before we go into the nitty-gritty of these documents, if you feel that this is absolute rubbish and it's just more red tape that we have to go through and we are already overstretched, then I think the reason why there is such emphasis on this at the moment is a simple fact that in Australia, more people die from fatal overdoses of prescription medication, and this is often at therapeutic doses, than from road traffic accidents. And if you think of all the regulation when we're talking about road safety, I mean, the fact that we have to wear seatbelts, no one's really questioning that, are they? I mean, obviously a lot of work has to happen here. Now, this is a great resource to just get you started. The RACGP has this kind of general website and a bit of information that pertains to Australia as a whole, but depending on where you're working, you will need to figure out your own state regulations. And there are links here on this website that unfortunately don't work. So if you're watching this RACGP, please fix the links on your website. But this is a great place to get started. And I have incorporated some of this information into the 3-page PDF that I can share with you. And the thing to point out here, and that they have highlighted, is that inappropriate Schedule A prescribing may result in criminal prosecution, financial penalties, and the loss of a doctor's ability to prescribe these drugs, and disciplinary action. And if you want to learn more about disciplinary action, I have created a video of why doctors are being reported to AHPRA, where I go into a little bit more detail about that. Now, like I've mentioned before, I am working in WA. And so the prescription code that applies to us as GPs in WA is right here. And what I will do is I will leave a link in the description below. And this is where the Schedule A medicines prescribing code lives. And when you click on that, it will open up a Word document, which is a little bit lengthy, and I have kind of broken it down for you in that PDF. And this is the document that we're talking about. And part 2 is where the fun begins, to be honest, because this sets out all of the rules that we have to follow when we are prescribing Schedule A drugs for our patients. And one thing I want to point out before we go into this is that I'm not here to tell you whether you should or you shouldn't be continuing those prescriptions for your patients. You just have to follow the rules if you are bent on prescribing those drugs for your patients. Now, I guess there are 2 things to point out here that are really, really important. And the first thing is a document called a treatment contract. And the second thing is a document called authorization to prescribe. And the treatment contract is described in section 245. That felt very cool. It felt like legal speak. The paragraph here is super short. And the reason why it's super short is because the treatment contract is actually a special document that you can download for free from the Department of Health website, and I will show you where that lives. And it is a piece of paper that you fill in with your patient in front of you, and you give that patient a copy of that treatment contract. And that treatment contract has to be issued if the prescription is going on for more than 30 days. I've mentioned in the past that I do a lot of locum work, and I have created a video where I describe why you would want to locum. But what I've noticed is that when I do locum work and you're a new doctor in that area, you will have a lot of patients trying you on, in a sense, and seeing if you'll be happy to prescribe Schedule A drugs, because a lot of doctors nowadays, realizing the risks of Schedule A drugs, just aren't keen on prescribing those and just won't perpetuate those prescriptions. And so by and large, through my training, I know that I shouldn't really be perpetuating prescriptions of opioid medication or benzos for things like chronic non-cancer pain. So that's things like back pain or knee pain or neck pain. So you're put in a really difficult position where you know that you shouldn't really be perpetuating these prescriptions, and yet you're just coming in, you're just covering, you don't want to upset anyone, you don't want to offend anyone. And so what I feel is that by knowing the rules and knowing what the rules are, it is much easier to manage those kind of situations. A treatment contract is a document that a patient carries with them at all time. And this is a document that is issued by your single prescriber GP. So that's something that is also specified in the prescribing code. And so this is a piece of paper that clearly states why the patient is on this medication, that they do have a regular GP, that their use is being monitored accordingly, and it sets out certain rules in terms of managing that prescription. And so if a patient comes in and they show me their treatment contract, and it's very clear that they have a regular GP who's doing these prescriptions, and they have a clear plan in terms of how to manage this, then that makes it much easier for us to prescribe these drugs. If a patient just comes in out of nowhere, they've been on these drugs for years, the doses are very high, and their regular GP hasn't really put in a treatment contract in place, hasn't applied for authority to prescribe, then unfortunately, I am unable to perpetuate that prescription for them, even if the practice is their regular GP, as it were. Now, the way that I brought up this treatment contract is I basically just Googled Schedule 8 drug treatment contract. And this was the first link. And I will go into a little bit more detail later on in terms of this treatment contract. But as you can see, it has the patient's name, 2 pages, patient signature, your medical practitioner's signature, and a bit of an explanation about why we need to sign a treatment contract. And so when I'm thinking about the steps that I need to follow before prescribing a Schedule 8 drug for a patient in a practice that I'm working in, the first step is, does the patient have a treatment contract? Do they need a treatment contract? And the reasons why someone would need a treatment contract is strictly specified within these resources that I'm showing you. Their prescription is expected to last or has lasted more than 30 days, or they have had issues with substance abuse in the previous 5 years, or they are on a total dose of over 90 milligrams morphine equivalents. And the last or is if they are on more than 45 milligrams of immediate release morphine equivalents. So that did seem like a lot of rules there, but actually the main rule that will apply to most of our patients, or most of the people that we are seeing, is a 30-day rule. Because we are talking about trying to address the issue of long-term prescriptions of opioid medication in conditions where they're not really indicated and that they can cause harm. And so if someone comes in and they have a prescription request, well, I will go through those steps. Does this patient need a treatment contract? Do any of those criteria apply? Now, secondly, if they do need a treatment contract, do they have a treatment contract? And the thing to point out here is that sometimes you will get a response of, oh, well, everything is in the computer, so just have a look in your computer. But the treatment contract is not something that is in the computer. I mean, I'm hoping it's in the computer, but a treatment contract is something that the patient has with them. So they have that contract, they can show it to me, they can show me who their doctor is, whether the treatment contract is valid because it is valid for 12 months, what kind of medication they're on, and what is the intended benefit of that medication. And if they do have that treatment contract, step 3 is we have to check if they are classed a drug-dependent person. And the way that you would do that is before issuing a prescription, you would check the relevant prescription shopping program. So in WA, we use ScriptCheck WA, and I have created that video where I explain exactly how to use ScriptCheck. So feel free to click on the link here. The alternative to using the online version is you can call the prescription shopping hotline, where you will speak to someone from the Department of Health, and they will tell you whether this person is getting prescriptions from other doctors or from other practices, where they are getting them from, and who is dispensing those drugs for them. Now, when we go through the treatment contract, it clearly says that you should be getting your prescriptions from only one prescriber and only going to one chemist. And so ScriptCheck WA will clearly say where this patient is getting their prescriptions from, who is prescribing that, and which chemist they are going to for them to dispense that medication for them. Now, the next step after you have checked the prescription shopping program is to assess whether this single prescriber GP needs to complete an authorization to prescribe form. And this will apply if the total dose is over what I've already talked about. So if the patient is on over 45 milligrams of morphine equivalents of an immediate release medication, or they are over 90 milligrams of morphine equivalents of a slow release or modified release medication. Now, I used to always think that calculating the morphine equivalent doses was actually really complicated, but it isn't. So I've included this table from the prescribing code in that PDF that I'm happy to share with you. And essentially it explains how you're supposed to use this table right here. So let's say we have a patient who is on some tapentadol, which is a really common drug nowadays. And let's say that their total dose is about 400 milligrams. So maybe they take 150 twice a day, and then they have 250s at some point. And so if I follow all the steps here, I just need to combine that into their daily dose. So 150 times 2 is 300. Plus 2 times 50 is 400. So I'm gonna put 400 into my calculator. And now what I have to do here is I just multiply it by the conversion factor. So I can see here that for tapentadol, the conversion factor is 0.3. So I'm gonna multiply this by 0.3, which means that they are getting 120 milligrams of morphine equivalents daily from their tapentadol. And so if I scroll back up to that bit where they're explaining where authority to prescribe is required, and we can clearly see here that this patient is on more than 90 milligrams of morphine equivalents. doses. So in that case, if you have a patient who's on those kind of doses, you have to apply for authority to be able to continue those prescriptions. And when I say you, I mean the regular GP. So if you are the regular GP, you have to do that. If you are the locum GP, it is the responsibility of the regular GP to have done that for the patient and for anyone who wants to continue those prescriptions for that patient. And if you want to know where you can fill in that form, it's right here on that website that I mentioned at the start of this video. And it's under applying for authorization. If you click on this link, this is the document that you need to fill in. Now, often, if a patient is on such high doses of opioid medication, you have to get a second doctor to make a recommendation for that patient to remain on that very high dose. And if you scroll down lower in the prescribing code, it will clearly say which specialties are able to make that recommendation. So you need a GP who thinks it's a good idea, and you need a specialist who thinks it's a good idea. You apply for authority, you send that off to the Department of Health, and you await their reply. They will do their checks and decide whether it is the right thing to do. And that authority to prescribe will only be valid for 12 months. And so let's be very clear here. This is different than applying to the PBS for authority, because that applies to the patients getting a subsidy so that their medication is cheaper. This is a separate application. So this isn't through best practice. This isn't through calling up the authority line. This is by filling in the paperwork that goes to the Department of Health. And then finally, the last step in this process of prescribing Schedule A drugs for your patients is assessing whether there is a shared care plan in place. The prescribing code does say that these prescriptions should come from a single prescriber. However, if there is a shared care plan in place, then other doctors from that practice can fill in those scripts as required. Now, I suspect that trying to find a shared care plan in the patient's notes may be very complicated. And so strictly speaking, if you have a treatment contract that the patient presents to you, you can see that the doctor has applied for authority to prescribe, or the doses that the patient is on are below what we've already specified before, then I think you could consider at that point perpetuating that prescription. Now, I personally have not been in that situation where all of those steps have been satisfied, but I'm sure there are certain circumstances and there's a certain cohort of patients who should be on these drugs and where those prescriptions should be continued. But I will obviously leave that to your own clinical discretion.